The second section that I'm taking from Chapter 6 is on group dynamics, but I'm also adding a couple of other things. As you can see, I ask you to watch a video. This is a video from the Discovering Psychology series, which is focused on social psychology. So it's a nice way to show how we're moving from this micro, which tends to be more individualistic, more the psychological realm. We're moving slowly upward to the macro level. We're still very much still on the micro. After reading this lecture, listening to this lecture and reading the chapter, you should be able to define the concept group dynamics. And then from this video that I've assigned, you should be able to define and describe the group dynamics. I'm going to cover leadership styles, conformity, obedience, perception of the situation, statuses, and roles. And then we'll finish up with group size, how that affects group dynamics, and then the last thing I'll mention will be social networks. When we talk about group dynamics, these are the patterns of interaction between the groups and the individual. In a way, it is still just looking at the individual in their social environment, but in effect, it's a two-way street. Groups affect us, and we affect groups. In the video that I ask you to watch, there are some very classic experiments that were done in psychology. The Ash experiment, which is the one with the lines, that's the one on conformity. The Milgram experiment is the one where people are giving electric shocks to each other. And then, of course, the Stanford prison experiment is when they pretend to be in prison, and it has some interesting effects on people and how they behave. What does this video tell us? Essentially, it talks about leadership types and style, also about conformity, also about obedience to authority, statuses and roles, and the connection between our definition of the situation and the actual physical situation itself. I'm going to walk through each one. Some I'll spend a little more time than others. The first thing that the video talks about is leadership, because there was a concern that maybe authoritarian leadership, I think they use the term autocratic in the video, but it's an authoritarian leadership. There was a concern that this might be the best rather than democracy. Mussolini particularly had a very good economy going, and quote unquote, the trains ran on time. So there was a concern at that period of time in history. One thing we know about leadership, as groups grow larger, there is a more formal leadership style. There are two types of leadership. One is called instrumental and one is called expressive. And we see this in many different types of situations. An instrumental type of leader is the one that is in charge of getting the task done. So you might have the boss at work who handles day-to-day activity, day-to-day operations. Their goal is to get the work done and get it done on time. An expressive leader is the one that is more concerned with the emotional relationships in the group. I'm sure there's always someone at the workplace who goes around kind of smoothing feathers or worrying about whether your child is sick or not. Probably you think that maybe that's the role that you play more often, because you're always the one that is helping your friends to stop fighting with each other or getting along better in the group. So there are two different types of leadership, but there's also a style of leadership, and this is what we saw in the video. There was the authoritarian leader who makes all of the decisions. He does not take input from the group, but he says, this is what we're going to do, and this is the way we're going to do it. Now get it done. That would be maybe in parenting style, that would be a very strict parent. Okay. The other extreme is laissez-faire, again, using a French term for hands-off or let it be. And sometimes we use for parenting style, we use the term a permissive parent. This is the parent that says, okay, if you want to stay up late, that's fine, but you know you got to get up in the morning and that's your responsibility. So they kind of are a hands-off type of parent. Okay. In the middle between those two are the democratic leadership style. Democratic leadership style would set some boundaries, but leave within those boundaries some decision making for the members of the group. And again, using the parenting style, this would be the parent that says bedtime is 9 o'clock, but in between you have to get your homework done. If you get your homework done before 9 o'clock, you can go online for a while and play a game. So it's setting boundaries, but letting some decisions be made by the members of the group. It's very interesting talking about parenting. The authoritarian and the laissez-faire parenting styles seem to have the same result in that the child feels less secure. A child feels more secure in the democratic type of parenting, that middle of the road. Another thing we see in the video that is part of the group dynamics is conformity. By this we mean adhering to the standards or opinion of the other members of the group, even if you disagree. So doing what the group expects you to do. We saw this with the 3 lines where the people were asked to match the lines on the left to the lines on the right, etc. And we found that 70% of the time, people tended to agree with the majority opinion, to go along because it wasn't that important. And there are some interesting experiments that talk about does this change with the importance of the task that's set out. So there, you know, I'm giving you an overview of a lot of this, but there are some very extensive reading on all of it. One of the things that comes out of this type of thinking is a term called groupthink, pressure for a high degree of conformity among the members. This, in a sense, creates a demand for unanimous agreement. You know, don't speak out, don't disagree, ever. We have seen this to some very tragic results in industry, in places that were producing parts for the space program, the very infamous Apollo 13, where things started blowing up and not working when they were halfway to the moon. And after they investigated to see what had happened, many people who work for the contractors said, we knew this, but we were under a lot of pressure not to speak out because we didn't want to delay, or we didn't want our company or corporation to take any blame for delaying the launch, I guess, of the moon rocket. We're seeing this today probably in Boeing with the MAX, the 737 MAX, where people are now coming out and saying, well, we knew this, but we were afraid to speak out. This creates what is called groupthink. Now, I guess a more positive group cohesion is the sense of solidarity or loyalty that individuals feel toward a group to which they belong. So this sense of belonging goes along with conformity, but they're not exactly the same. Subtle difference between the two. Okay, here are some of the other things that were seen in the video. Obedience, where we saw people giving other people the electric shock. And the question, of course, this was after World War II, where people were questioning whether the guards were making other people give other people shocks in the concentration camps. And we found that, yes, people do tend to do even horrible things like giving electric shock if they feel that they are in a situation where they should obey. And in this experiment where the guy was wearing the coat, which gives him authority, we found that people, yes, would give other people shocks. In the prison experiment, there are many things in the prison experiment, but of course I think what stands out is how changing a person's status, saying your position is the prison guard, and here's what's expected of a prison guard. So with the status comes role expectations, which we talked about in an earlier lecture. I think one of the most interesting or the cutest of the experiments that's shown to us in the video is the one where they're on the beach, and the young lady goes over to ask the man to watch her radio. She's going, to get a drink or something. And what we see is that by reaching out, by talking, by establishing a relationship, that we also establish responsibility. By saying, would you do this? He now feels a responsibility for her radio. And then the last one connects the physical with the perception. How, depending on how important something is to us, we may see it differently. And so when the situation changed, the participants in the research actually had a different perception of what they were expected to see. Group size is something that the textbook mentions, that it does affect interaction. We can see from this diagram that in group size, when there's only 2 people, it's only 1 interaction, and they keep growing and growing. When you have 4 people in the group, there are 6 interactions possible. By the time you get up to 7 people in the group, there are 21 interactions possible, which makes a more complicated situation and more pressure on people to respond. Sometimes it's hard to respond to all 21 people, even if you think it looks like a small group. Here are some of the other effects of group size. As a group gets larger, the group becomes more stable. Think about those sizes we just saw on the last slide. If there are only 2 people, think of a couple. If one of them leaves the group, say it's a divorce or a breakup, then the group no longer exists. But if you have a situation where there are 3 people, think again of 2 parents and 1 child. If there is a divorce or breakup, if one of the parents leave, there's still the family group. So again, as you get larger, the group becomes more stable. However, when you get to very large groups, the intimacy begins to decrease. By intimacy, if you look at that large group of 7 people, you actually have 21 different interactions, and maybe there's not time to have interactions with everyone. Okay? We find large groups do break into smaller groups, and as a group gets larger, there is a diffusion of responsibility, something that's sometimes called social loafing, or where responsibility falls between the cracks. Oh, I thought you were going to do that. Oh, I thought you were going to do it. And of course, nobody did it. So we lose the responsibility for tasks being done. Social network is the kind of this web we have of direct and indirect ties connecting an individual to groups of people. Maybe your father knows the president of a college, and so he introduces you to the president, which helps your chances of getting into the university. Or maybe your friend knows someone who is going on a trip, and that person can tell you about the trip, etc. So it's kind of it's not a group as such, but it's a networking or this connection that we have. Up until about the 1990s, this was done almost entirely in person, or maybe on the telephone, etc. But since the internet, we have this electronic networking. LinkedIn is one of the great examples. And the question becomes, how can we best use them? There are many people who have come up with ways that businesses can use them, that individuals use them. I don't think anything takes the place of face-to-face, but in today's world, it's probably easier or faster to use some of the electronic networking that is available. We're not quite sure exactly of the effect. A lot of research still needs to be done. Okay, this finishes the parts of Chapter 6 that we're going to cover this week. This also completes all of the lectures and the readings that will be on the exam next week. In this particular lecture, we've talked about the social dynamics, group dynamics. These include conformity, cohesion, groupthink, a diffusion of responsibility. The things that affect this, of course, are size of the group, but also the type of leadership that's in a group and the various styles of leadership that are involved. The last thing we talked about was social networks. They connect us to others, but again, not always on a face-to-face basis.